our panel. We'll now turn to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Grimm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel. Mr. Giancarlo, since you just finished, I'll start with you, if I may. I wanted you to expand a little bit about the multiple modes of execution. I, for one, think it's important: voice, hybrid, electronic. These modes, if you can expand why it's so important to have multiple modes rather than a wholly electronic platform, I would ask you that question.
Thank you, Congressman. The liquidity in the swaps market is very different than in the futures and equities markets, the nature of liquidity. Just to give you an example, 80% of the reference entities, swaps on 80% of the reference entities in the credit derivative market trade less than 5 times a day. It's not the same type of marketplace where you have a continuous tape that you do in a futures market or an equities market. And therefore, the means by which experienced intermediaries bring parties together in this marketplace are very different. At GFI Group and at our competing wholesale brokerage firms, we use a range of methodologies, everything from online auction systems to fixing and matching sessions, as well as fully electronic online platforms. But we also use a mix of humans and electronic systems. And often that's very effective in bringing parties together.
That begs the question, if I may. It appears to me that the CFTC has relied heavily upon the regulations governing the futures contracts and drafting the proposed rules for the swaps. Are the regulations for the futures industry appropriate for the swaps industry? And if not, why?
There may be some elements of how regulations work in the futures industry that are appropriate, but many, many other ways they're inappropriate. And in the proposed regulations, there's a number of areas where the proposed regs simply just don't apply. I mean, just simple things like referring to products listed on CEFs or members of CEFs. These are concepts that really don't exist in the swaps market, and yet as we read the proposed rulemaking, these concepts still come through and are inappropriate for what takes place in the swaps market.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. If I can switch over to Mr. Donahue, your testimony expressed concerns about fragmentation of data. Doesn't the technology exist already for the regulators to easily consolidate the data it receives from various swap data repositories?
Well, Congressman, I would certainly agree it exists. I don't think I would use the word easily. You can consolidate the data. I think our point is the data is already consolidated. The data has been unified in a swap data repository. Having that consolidated view and having the infrastructure that we have to permit regulators in the market access to that consolidated view is very, very key to meeting the transparency goals that the Act has and that Congress had in adopting the Act. Allowing that to fragment and allowing the data to split out into pieces that get distributed in different forms in different data vendors, and then imposing the obligation to then reunify that and consolidate that is, we think, going to be a fairly difficult process, a complex process, an expensive process, and certainly add very significant time to the market's ability to establish the transparency that Congress and the regulators want.
One more question, Mr. Donahue. Other than the congressional mandate that trades be reported, explain why we need repositories, please.
Well, again, the repository gives a consolidated view of all of the activity within a particular asset class so that you can see all of the exposures, you know who has what exposures, you can see information about contracts conducted globally. This is a global market.
Could I just ask you, why can't the clearinghouses collect the information, since they are the central nexus, for the derivatives, and let them send the information to the SEC and the CFTC?
Well, your question answers it. Okay, the clearinghouses necessarily will fragment the data, and you're going to be dealing with different groups of data reflecting different activities, different contracts. You may see offsetting contracts in different clearinghouses. You have to bring it together in some place. You have to aggregate it to see the entire view. That's precisely what swap data repositories do, going there and using that infrastructure from day one, we believe is the appropriate public policy choice.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman